ever had an idea that you thought was like the best idea in the world, and then you end up like on the other side of it, and you're like, wait, what was I thinking, right? Well, that's the title of tonight's message is, what was I thinking? Turn to your neighbor and say, what was I thinking? I feel like everybody's asked that at one point or another, right? Everybody said, what was I thinking? It might be, maybe you like tried to cook something in the kitchen and you had this great idea of what it was gonna be. It turns out it's like disgusting and you're like, what was I thinking? Or, maybe like as a girl, like you decide to like chop off your hair. That's the thing, right? Like I feel like girls, once they get long hair, they're like, I'm gonna chop it off, right? Like why? Why? Like, just keep it. But they're like, nah, I'm going to chop it off. And then they do. And they're like, what was I thinking? Or like, if you're in the stock, I'm in the stock market a little bit. But so is Ruben. You like sell low, right? And then all of a sudden it goes up. And you're like, what was I thinking? But everybody's been in a season where they're like, what was I thinking? And I remember a moment in my life. Kyle was there. We went to high school together. And we pretty much got in trouble together a lot. We were bad influences on each other back then, but God redeemed. So we're picking up our friend in Buckley at the time, and Buckley is, it's just out there. It's just like not even mapped at this point, I'm pretty sure, like on Google Maps. Like nobody knows how to navigate Buckley. So we're going out to my friend's house in Buckley. He's giving us like vague directions, like it's like 1980s. He's like, you're gonna pass a railroad, and then you're gonna go right, and then there's gonna be a man with a briefcase there. Go past him, don't talk to him. And we're like, what? Like, what are we talking about? So we get to his house, and it's like a mile-long driveway, but it's so narrow. And so we get to his house, and it's me, Kyle, and one of our other buddies. We pick him up. And it's so narrow that there's no way to turn around. Like there's literally like the house and there's trees. And so Jake, our friend, he's like, oh, you just gotta back up all the way. So we're like, all right, whatever. So we're backing up and we're like joking around about it. And we're like having fun because we're like going in reverse. Then also we get out to the main road and it's like 11 o'clock at night. What were we doing at 11 o'clock at night? Who knows? But it's 11 o'clock at night and the road is deserted. And I turn to my friend who's driving, and I'm like, you won't keep going in reverse? Like, how stupid is that? Like, what are we talking about? But at the time, it was like a great idea for all of us. We're like, that's the best idea I've ever heard. So he's like, bet, and he puts it in reverse, and we're going in reverse on a main road in Buckley. And so it's really relaxing. It's like 10 miles per hour. We're all joking, having fun. And Kyle's like, I bet you won't go faster. And like normally, like when I look back, it's like, obviously, no, that's a dumb idea. But at the time, we're like, yeah, that's the best idea I've ever heard. Go faster. So he's like, okay. And he's in a Jeep. So it's like, we feel indestructible. So he starts like cranking it in reverse. We're still laughing, and it's like accelerating. And then have you ever been in that moment where it's like, what was I thinking? It like kind of starts to come to the front of my brain as we're getting faster and faster. And like our laughs get like less and less. And also we're all silent. And my friends, I'm not joking, I looked at the speedometer, and he's going 40 miles per hour in reverse. And all of a sudden, it goes like this. And he starts losing control, and I'm not joking. We start going left and right. We pop up on two wheels of this car. I promise you I'm not lying about this. We pop up on two wheels. We're screaming at this point. Car goes back, and we take a sharp right turn because the wheel gets jerked. We take a sharp right turn, and we go like literally 30 feet into the woods, and we stop, and we look around, and we're staring at each other like, wait, what just happened? And we look behind us, and I'm not joking, a giant tree, was literally less than a foot away from the car. Like, looking back on that, I think about that. Sometimes me and Kyle talk about that, and we're like, dude, we are so stupid. Like, what? Who does that? Like, what? How did we get to that point? But it's crazy because in the moment, our thoughts controlled our behavior, and our thoughts were super deceiving. We thought it was super fun, when in actuality, it was really, really dangerous. And what happened there is something that happens to us a lot of times, in the sense that I was being controlled by my thoughts. And of people of faith, we have to ask ourselves, this is the big question tonight. My question to you is, are you being controlled by your thoughts, or are you controlling your thoughts? Do you have control over your thoughts, or do your thoughts have control over you? And that's a big, big difference in terms of the way that we see how we walk with the Lord. Because like I said, nothing happens, no action happens that doesn't originate in our mind. So what we have to do, and what I feel like is super neglected sometimes in the church, is how are we processing the way that we think about the things of God? And so we're going to get into a story, but I just feel like it's so important to know, how do I think? How are things filtered in my mind in a way that honors God? And I think it's super funny because we will have parameters, we'll have boundaries for everything in our lives, right? Physically, like, okay, yeah, we go on diets, we exercise. There's boundaries there, right? We have boundaries in place to make sure that we are physically healthy. Financially, like we talked about finances a little bit ago, but you have budgets in place to make sure that you are financially healthy. But why do we never have boundaries on what we think? Why do we have zero boundaries when it comes to what am I allowed to think and what am I not allowed to think? And what happens is our thoughts become so free that all of a sudden there is leniency, and we invite thoughts that aren't supposed to be there, that lead to actions that aren't supposed to happen. And so tonight, we have to come to the conclusion, we have to understand, okay, how am I thinking? What are the boundaries there? And how do I get past that? Because, you know, it's a startling statistic that in the pandemic, if you didn't know, in the COVID pandemic, 56% of young adults said that they experienced anxiety or depression. 56. If you look around the room, that's more than every other person that you're looking at have said that they have experienced anxiety or depression in what they're thinking. And what my suspicion is, COVID caused us to slow down a little bit, right? We're not like running around doing everything. It caused us to slow down. But when we slow down, all we have is our thoughts. And what happened is a young generation has failed to filter and censor what we're thinking, so we just let everything in. And so when we have a season where all we're doing is thinking, of course we're going to be stuck in a place where it's unhealthy because we've never set boundaries there in the first place to be able to say, hey, I should or I shouldn't be thinking about this. And so we're actually going to jump in to a story here. It's in Exodus chapter 4, verse 1 through 5. But before we put that up, could you put up Romans 12:2? I love this. Romans 12:2. It says, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind. Everybody say renewal. That by testing you may discern what the will of God is, what is good and acceptable and perfect. So we have to train our mind to be renewed every single day. How many of you know that this is kind of a crazy world that we live in, right? I need renewal in my mind every single day. But it's hard, and here's why thinking, our thoughts, our mind is the hardest place to find obedience and submit it to God, is because there is zero accountability to it. Think about it, right? If I tell my friend, hey, I want to stop swearing. I swear too much. I want to stop swearing. We're in public, and I swear. He can hit me in the shoulder. He'd be like, hey, you're not supposed to do that. That's accountability, right? If I tell somebody that I want to change my lifestyle, I want to act a different way, they can see that. So people can hear what I'm saying. People can see what I'm doing, but nobody will ever see what I'm thinking. Nobody will ever see what you're thinking. That is between you and God, unless you let somebody in. And so if that's the most dangerous place for thoughts to wander, then how many of you know that that's where the enemy's going to probably hit us the hardest? It's the easiest target because you have no community in your mind. And so what we have is a generation that needs to put boundaries in place to protect us from the very thing that the enemy would want to use to derail us, to derail our calling. And so we're going to jump into Exodus chapter 4, verse 1. So to give a little context, this is my favorite story in the Bible. It's the story of a guy named Moses. And so really, really fast, Moses was a guy, he was a Hebrew. And his people were, the nation of Israel were enslaved in Egypt at the time. Okay, so the nation of Israel was enslaved in Egypt. Moses accidentally killed a guy, ran away, so he's no longer in Egypt. He killed an Egyptian, had to run away, spent 40 years as a shepherd, and then finally God comes to him 40 years later and says, hey, I need you to help me deliver my people out of Israel. Okay, so we're going to jump into kind of this conversation between Moses and God. So he has this incredible calling although he's just been in a season of 40 years after a mistake that he's made. And so we're going to pick up, I don't know if it's going to come on the screen. I'm going to just read it from right here. There it is, Exodus 4, chapter 4, 1 through 5. I'm going to read it. You can follow along on the screen. So this is after God called Moses to say, hey, lead my people out of Egypt. Then Moses answered, but behold, they will not believe me or listen to my voice, for they will say, the Lord did not appear to you. The Lord said to him, what is that in your hand? He said, a staff. And he said, throw it on the ground. So he threw it on the ground, and it became a serpent, and Moses ran from it. But the Lord said to Moses, put out your hand and catch it by the tail. So he put out his hand and caught it, and it became a staff in his hand. So they may believe that the Lord, the God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has appeared to you. So the first point of how to walk and journey in a wise way of thinking is, number one, you have to release your past. You have to release your past. Context is huge in Scripture, and so the context of this is actually, it's really cool because, first of all, Moses messed up a long time ago, right? And he ran away. And God is now calling him back. And the second that God calls him back, Moses says, okay, but nobody is going to listen to me. Nobody's going to believe me. Nothing is going to happen through me. And it's interesting because a verse before that, God literally told Moses in chapter 3, verse 18, hey, people will listen to you. Okay, so it's not like God never mentioned it. God said, hey, if you go, if you follow me, people will listen to you. And Moses' direct reply to God is, I don't agree. I don't think they will. So if you're having an audible conversation with God, right? Think about it. I mean, there's a bush, right, that's talking to him, a burning bush. And if you're having an audible conversation with God, and God says, hey, you should do this, this is what's going to happen, I don't know if I'm in a position to say, I doubt it. You know, like, we're talking about God here. But the way that Moses thought challenged God. He felt the need to challenge the sovereignty of God because of what he had experienced. Because he's saying, whoa, wait, why in the world would anybody listen to me? And it's in this very moment that God releases his past. Because you cannot become free spiritually in your mind. You cannot become healthy if you are gridlocked and you are paralyzed by your past. And what happens is God asks, hey, what's in your hand? Moses replies, a staff. And it might seem random, but it's really not. Because Moses' season as a shepherd was not a happy season. It was, the staff was a reminder of the place that he put himself in because of his mistakes. So God released Moses by pointing to the staff and saying, hey, what you had in your past, I'm still going to use for your calling today. Okay, because releasing has two different definitions. To be released from our past, you have to have both. The first type of release is like when you open a cage and you let something out. That's like releasing it, right? The second type of release is to set in motion. That's the two types of releasing, right? So in the same sentence that God calls Moses, he tells Moses, hey, I know that you did this in your past, but I'm still calling you to an incredible thing. He releases Moses from the cage of insecurity and the cage of shame, saying, hey, that doesn't matter what you did. I'm still calling you to something really well. In the same exact breath, he releases Moses to say, not only is what you did in the past not potent or effective to what you're doing today, but I'm actually going to use what happened then to advance my plan for you today. So there's a relationship that has to happen with your past, and you have to know that to be released from your past means that you accept it, but you don't forget about it. Because in my opinion, history in your past, it's a great teacher, it's a terrible Lord, right? Your past is a great teacher, it's a terrible authority over your life. And the enemy would want you to sit in your past and remember all the things you did wrong. And hey, this is the reason that you're not qualified to do what you did today. And I've met so many people that say, oh yeah, I really want to do this, but what happened over here kind of disqualifies that. Nothing disqualifies that. Nothing disqualifies that call that God has on your life. And Moses he had to get past his shame. He had to get past the idea that he was not qualified because of what he did. And that's where we have to come today, is if you want to be wise in the way that you're thinking, if you want to have the wisdom of your mind, you have to accept your past, accept the things that you did wrong, but understand that God can still use that for what he's calling you today and tomorrow. Amen? Amen. Awesome. So number 2 is we have to face the present. So number 1 is release the past. Number 2 is face the present. Why don't you turn to someone and say, face the present. Face the present. So we're going to skip through Exodus. It's a long story. So basically, he gives Moses the staff, and he says, hey, you gotta go. Here's my sign. It'll turn into a snake so people know that basically you're from me, because it's a miracle. It's a sign. So what happens is Moses goes to Pharaoh, just like God said. So he gets over his shame. He's like, okay, I'm ready to be obedient to you, Lord. He goes to Pharaoh. He does his trick, and Pharaoh actually has a hard heart, which means like he doesn't accept it. He's offended that Moses would even ask such a thing. So what does Pharaoh do is he actually makes it harder for the people that are enslaved. So he says, first of all, no, I'm not going to free all the slaves that I have. Why would you even ask such a thing? And on top of that, to mock Moses, he says, actually, I'm going to make it harder for your people now. And so what he does is he puts regulations in place that make the labor harder. And obviously people are upset with Moses at this point because they're like, why didn't you just shut your mouth, bro? Like, why are you trying? You're making it harder for us. So Moses, in chapter 5, verse 22 through 23, Moses comes back to God. And then it says, then Moses turned to the Lord and said, O Lord, why have you done evil to this people? Why did you ever send me? For since I came to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has done evil to his people and have not delivered your people at all. So Moses comes to God and he's like, why would you tell me to do this? Because it's not going good. Like, you told me to do this, to forget about my past and be obedient to you. And he's like, I'm doing that and it's not working. And the first time I read this, I kind of saw this as doubt a little bit. Like, Moses, why are you doubting God? But the more that I looked at it, the more that I saw that this is an important progression that we have to recognize in Moses to understand how we can progress today in our thinking. Because slowly throughout this story, the way that Moses is thinking about himself and thinking about God is slowly starting to change. And how I know that is because you look at Moses previously, when he accidentally killed the Egyptian, he made a mistake, he failed, and what did he do? He ran away. Now we see Moses, he still does this, he goes, he fails, he does not run away, he runs to God. It's a big key difference in the story of Moses. He didn't run away when he failed, he ran to God. He didn't avoid the things that were happening, he ran to God. And the thing that I'm telling you is such a killer in the way that we think, in the way that we process in our mind, is we are so good at avoiding and rationalizing and making things go away that are uncomfortable in our lives. I'm telling you, you gotta face your present today. You gotta face the realities in your life. You gotta face the issues that you're dealing with. You know, there's a psychological study that said we are best at lying to ourselves. It's called self-deception. That humans naturally are really good at detecting people that are lying to them, and we are terrible at detecting lying to ourselves. It was actually a study that said we lie to ourselves all the time, and we accept it. Because we want to accept it, we want to be comfortable. It's like, have you ever met that guy that's like, I'm a great driver, and then you get in the car with him and you're like, you're gonna kill me, right? Or like, hey, somebody that thinks that they're a good singer, and it's like, do you have hearing? You ain't a good singer, you know what I'm saying? But we are so good at lying to ourselves. It's such, and I do it, and you do it, we all do it. In 2 Corinthians 10:5, it says, we demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God, and we take captive every thought, every single thought, to make it obedient to Christ. We take captive every thought. It's easier to not think about the uncomfortable thoughts that come to us, right? It's easy to rationalize. It's easy to bury it. And what's crazy is we think on average, some people are over, some people are under, we think on average 50,000 thoughts a day. Isn't that crazy? 50,000 thoughts go through our mind every single day. And you know what's even crazier is 80% of those thoughts are negative thoughts. Of the 50,000 thoughts that we think every single day, 80% are going to be negative. So if you're telling me you ain't got a filter for the way that you're thinking and you're letting 50,000 thoughts come through and you're refusing to take captive those thoughts, of course if 80% is negative, you're going to have a negative outlook on the life. If 80% is coming in negative, you're going to have a negative outlook on yourself, on God, on the church, because we need a filter for our thoughts. 50,000 thoughts go through our heads. And what is your defense mechanism with your mind? We have to have one. We have to have a defense mechanism. Because at the end of the day, we can lie to ourselves all day, but if we don't accept truth, I love in John, Jesus is talking to some people, and they don't believe that Jesus is who he says he is. They're rejecting truth. And Jesus looks at them and he says, if you're rejecting truth, you're children of the devil. And the devil is the father of lies. Like it's like, wow, okay, Jesus, like that's heavy. Like, don't call us that. But the fact of the matter is the devil is the father of lies. And you don't think he's gonna wanna sneak in a couple in those 50,000 of lies about you, lies about your calling, lies about your relationship, lies about your church, lies about the people in your life that you love, of your faith, of your devotion, of your calling, of course. And if we don't got a filter, how can we be wise in what we're thinking? We need that filter to be able to get the gross thoughts out of our lives. Because you may ignore them, but they ain't going anywhere, right? Because our mind, like I said, my mind is like a river. Everything that comes in goes out. There's no thought that comes in that will stay there and won't manifest in the way that we act or the things that we say. So we have to have that filter. And I'm going to invite the band back up to go into our third point. So the progression of Moses is, it's awesome. So God releases Moses from his past, meaning that he doesn't hold anything against Moses. And also, he says, hey, your past is actually beneficial for what I'm doing for you today. So Moses' past is released. Then, point 2 is he faces his reality. He faces his reality. He faces his failure, the hardship, the things that he doesn't want to talk about, the things that he's uncomfortable with, he faces. And so as we go through Exodus, Moses continues to be obedient to God. And God basically, everything that God says is going to happen, happens. And eventually, Pharaoh decides to let the Israelites go. God gives plagues to Egypt, and Pharaoh's heart finally, he's like, okay, I've had enough. So he lets the nation of Israel go. So this is good news. They're on their way out. They're leaving. And we're going to pick up in Exodus chapter 14, verse 10 through 14. So this is after Pharaoh released the nation of Israel. But after he released them, he says, actually, I think I changed my mind, because he sees everything he's missing out on. So he releases the people, and then he changes his mind. He sends his entire army to go after them. And I love this verse. I love this story. In chapter 14, verse 10, it says, when Pharaoh drew near, so the people of Israel are running away, and Pharaoh's chasing them. When Pharaoh drew near, the people of Israel lifted up their eyes, and behold, the Egyptians were marching after them. And they feared greatly, like anyone would. And the people of Israel cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, is it because there are no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? What have you done to us in bringing us out of Egypt? Is not this what we said to you in Egypt? Leave us alone that we may serve the Egyptians. For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness. And Moses said to the people, fear not, stand firm. Moses said to the people, "Fear not. Stand firm and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will work for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall never see again. The Lord will fight for you, and you have only to be silent." I just love the development of Moses, because it's the development that he calls us all to have today. We look at Moses, and in the beginning, he's frightened, he's doubtful, he's held by his past. He struggles with God, saying, "How could you possibly tell me to do this?" Then we pick up in the second point, and he's doing it, and he's struggling, and he's fighting, and he's frustrated, but he's doing it. He's journeying. He's taking the steps of faith. He's listening to God. And then we see him. And when the entire nation of Israel sees Egypt coming, what does it say? It says they're afraid. And they turn to Moses, and they're mad. And they're like, we told you that we didn't want this. We told you that we wanted to stay in Egypt, and now basically you're going to get us killed. And the frightened, doubtful, insecure Moses that we saw 10 chapters ago, he says, "Fear not. Stand firm and see the salvation of the Lord." Moses couldn't say, "See the salvation of the Lord," if he didn't see it himself first. He couldn't be confident that God was going to work for him and work for them if God didn't work for him first. And what Moses did is he journeyed and he understood the wisdom of how he thought about himself and how he thought about God, and he brought it to him in a way that shaped his faith and shaped the way that he thought, so that when others around him were experiencing the same thing that he was experiencing a little bit ago, all he said was, "Don't worry, I was there. God will provide. God will do it." He was released, he faced reality, and then he could go in the victory. And that's the third point, is he was able to trust God's future. That's the final part of having wisdom in the way that we think, is because we had to be released in our past. We have to face our present. But if we be released, if we face our reality, then that will prepare us for the future that God has for us. And that's where God calls every single one of us to be. And it's a journey. And you might be on one side of the spectrum, or you might be on the other side of like, "Hey, I trust God with all my heart." Or maybe you're coming in here and you're like, "I've never trusted God at all." But I want you to know that this is a generation that will rise or it will fall on the way that we see ourselves and the way that we see God. The way that we think about ourselves and the way that we think about God. I mean, I look at that statistic of 56% of people struggling with anxiety and depression. You know, you hear stories of the suicide rates going through the roof when people are alone, and it's frightening and it's discouraging. But to understand, we have to battle, we have to filter the way that we think, because in the end, that leads to the victory that God has for us. So as we wrap up, I just invite everybody to bow your heads and close your eyes. I feel like there's two responses tonight.